read a second time. I call the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on this appropriations bill this evening, and I'd like to just touch on 3 or 4 issues from the budget, and then also briefly mention the ice epidemic, which is occurring in my electorate as it is across the entire country, and some of the things which we are doing in relation to that. But if I could start just by talking about the aggregate budget and what we were trying to achieve, and let me just touch on 2 or 3 things. The first and foremost thing is that we have to get control of Labor's debt and deficit disaster, and this budget continues the work of last year's budget in terms of getting control of the spending and providing a very clear pathway back to surplus. And so when you look at the macro figures of this budget, the budget deficit reduces each and every year from $35.1 billion in 2015-16 to $6.9 billion in 2018-19. And we do that in part because we've been very disciplined on the spending side, keeping spending down to 1.5%, whereas we inherited spending growth at 3.7% real growth, which of course is just completely unsustainable. So that's the most important macro measure, if you like, Mr Deputy Speaker, getting control of Labor's debt and deficit disaster. And that is so important because really this is about the future generations. And if we don't get on top of the debt and deficit today, then it will be our children and our grandchildren that will be having to pay it back. And that was Labor's legacy. They set up a tremendous debt trajectory, and we are getting firmly on top of this in this budget, building on last year's budget work. The second point I'd like to raise from this year's budget is something very important for all Australians, and it's particularly important in my electorate, and that is small business support. Now, there's 11,000 small businesses in my electorate, which is a huge number of small businesses. They are the backbone of our local economy, and amongst those, about a third are business services, about a fifth are in the construction, a further fifth in distribution services, and about a tenth are in manufacturing businesses. And in all cases, those business owners, they work hard, they frequently mortgage their house in order to get loans to keep their business afloat. They're typically incredibly proud about the services they offer and about the employees which they can take on and provide for. And what this budget initiative does, and this is the centrepiece of the federal budget, is it provides a turbo boost for these small businesses. And it does it in 2 ways, Mr Deputy Speaker. Firstly, by providing them with a tax cut of 1.5%, and that occurs whether you're an incorporated business or an unincorporated business. And second, it provides an instant asset write-off for every purchase up to $20,000, and that's effective immediately. And what that means is that businesses can go out today, make a purchase, and then they can immediately write that off against this year's tax, effectively reducing their tax and increasing their cash flow. And what that will do is provide a real stimulus for those small businesses to go and spend money, to invest, to grow and to employ people locally. And that's what I think is so positive about this particular budget measure. It really provides a stimulus for the small business sector, which is at the heart of our overall economy in my seat in Aston and indeed across the nation. And I hope that the Labor Party will support that initiative. We do need to get legislation through the Parliament, and I trust that they will back that initiative because it is so important. I touch on, of course, the families package, and small business was at the centrepiece. The families package was also very important, and Minister Morrison oversaw this, and in essence it is providing additional support for those parents who want to go back to the paid workforce who have children. And it does this by providing additional assistance for the childcare sector. And the effect of this particular measure is that, on average, low and middle income families will be about $1,500 a year better off if they're using the childcare system. $1,500. And what it does is it provides just that extra incentive, should they choose to exercise it, to get back into the paid workforce because they can afford the childcare system. And you would know, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I do, so many families who sit around the kitchen table who decide that one of the parents won't go back to work because really the cost benefit isn't worth it when they weigh up what they'll earn versus what the costs of childcare are, and this actually this particular measure tilts the balance in favour of providing the opportunity to go back to the workforce should they choose to do so. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, in relation to the budget, I'd raise the issue of infrastructure. Now, this is very dear to all of our hearts, and it's particularly important in a state like Victoria and a city like Melbourne. Melbourne is growing by 100,000 people each and every year, by far the fastest growing city in Australia. And what that means, unless we're building the infrastructure to keep up with that, then the roads and the rail systems come to a standstill. And we've been seeing that over the years, that increasingly the Melbourne's traffic has been slowing down and congestion has been getting worse. What we had, though, was a huge infrastructure project to address that particular congestion issue, and it was called the East-West Link. And it was planned, it was put on the agenda under the Brumby government, it was planned for under the Baillieu government, and then funded under the Napthine government, and it was all ready to go, contracts signed, and of course we know what Daniel Andrews did to that. He cancelled that contract. He spent $640 million in the process not to build that road, and effectively means that we don't have a single large infrastructure project in Melbourne at the moment. The only city in Australia that doesn't have a big infrastructure project underway, and it's the city which has the fastest growth by a considerable margin, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, what we have done in this budget is that we have said that there is $3 billion quarantined for the East-West Link should a Victorian government choose to build it. And a Victorian government will build it because it must be built, because it will create 7,000 jobs, it will end the Hoddle Street bottleneck, and it will finally connect the eastern side of the city, a further connection from the eastern side of the city to the western side of the city, a project which every single transport plan has suggested, Mr Deputy Speaker. Let me finally, in the last 6 or 7 minutes, mention a further topic which was not directly budget related but is nevertheless incredibly important, and it's an important one, I think, for all members of this House, and that is the ice epidemic and how we should be addressing this and thinking about this. And I think every single member of this House has probably come across families that have suffered or from the consequences of ice. And we know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it is an absolute epidemic in Victoria, in the nation, and it is increasingly a problem in my electorate in Victoria. The actual rate of ice use has doubled in the last 12 months alone, from 22% in 2010 to 50% in 2013. And those using ice are doing it more frequently, with people using it at least monthly doubling from 2010 to 2013, from 12% to 25% to around 90,000 Australians aged 14 and over. This drug is an insidious drug. It is killing our young people, and it absolutely destroys families. And we know that the ice addiction itself can cause all sorts of psychosis and long-term mental health issues. It makes people aggressive, considerably increases the risk of stroke and of heart failure. And offences involving ice now make up 16% of all drug crime, compared with only 3% 5 years ago. This is an epidemic which we must get on top of. In my electorate of Aston, it is, I won't say the epicentre, but it is one of the biggest problem areas in the outer east, is in the Knox municipality, which basically has the same boundaries of my federal electorate of Aston. There's twice as many drug offences occurred in Knox compared to the adjacent municipality of Maroondah. Charges from possessing drug manufacturing equipment in Knox grew from 0 to 20 just over the last few years. It's an incredible drug where 687 drug offences were recorded in Knox last year, more than twice as many in Maroondah. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have a national task force which is looking into this problem. It's headed up by the former Victorian Police Commissioner, Ken Lay, who is a very highly regarded figure, and he's consulting across the nation to look into this problem, get ideas as to what we can do nationally, what can be done at the state level, and what can be done locally and in amongst communities. And I'll be hosting a ICE forum myself in my electorate in the coming weeks in order to gather the evidence and information from local people in my community. Attending that forum will be both political representatives as well as experts in the field and people who have been affected by this, as well as people who are concerned about its incidences and believe that they have a contribution to make. I've already received an enormous amount of local feedback in relation to this problem, largely just from emails, from responses to my newsletters and from Facebook. And broadly, the themes which people put through, at least from my electorate, are very consistent in relation to this problem. They say, for example, that we must tackle the supply of ice, particularly through stronger penalties for suppliers, and there was many people who made that comment. There was a strong view that we need to consult very broadly, including with ice users themselves, as we develop our strategy. And perhaps the third theme which came out is that we need additional funding for rehabilitation, for prevention services and for early education services in order to be able to ensure that people are fully aware of what the problems are, and then to be able to seek help very quickly should they find themselves in difficulty. Madam Deputy Speaker, I look forward to this forum, which we'll be hosting in a few weeks' time. I think this will be a very good way of eliciting further feedback from our local community, and that feedback will then be fed into the National ICE Task Force. I know of very few people in our local community who are not concerned about this drug. I've either seen or heard of its effects, and it's something that as a nation we are taking very, very seriously, and something at the local level that I'm taking seriously also.